please support the passage of this bill. Thank you.
I recognise the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Thank you, and likewise, sir. Mr. Speaker, we have indeed. Mr. Speaker, as colleagues on both sides of the House, there is quite a bit of unanimity in respect of this bill. The aim, as we know, is to enable the Crown to recover costs of aviation security, biosecurity and customs travel processing from operators of new or re-established international airports. I would also acknowledge Shane Ardern, having sat on the Primary Production Committee in its more lively days. That is one member who I think should have been put in higher office many years ago, and he more than most knows the impact, both positive and negative, of biosecurity on his industry. But I would say this, that there has been a trend with this government of a sort of obsession with constantly restructuring. There's been a government obsession, of course, with merging biosecurity in New Zealand. Biosecurity in New Zealand has been through 2 restructurings under this government, now part of primary industries. And I know my colleague Damien O'Connor has expressed quite a bit of concern around that, where you have sort of, poacher and gamekeeper amalgamated together. And we do know, and I'm sure Mr. Ardern will help me out, but we do know it almost seems like a monthly or weekly occurrence where we have another incursion. I heard on the radio there's some other fly or flea or something that's got in. Now, whilst I accept we have a huge border, a massive geographical border to protect, we are close to our Australian cousins who have a few more gremlins than we do in New Zealand. But the point is this, that there has to be an obsession, not simply with constantly restructuring and saving a few quid here and there, but actually reinforcing the work and the resources of those agencies and people who have the ultimate responsibility to protect the border. We talk about, for instance, terrorism, physical violence and terrorism in that form. What is of possibly even greater threat, some would say, is if you like, biosecurity terrorism. Whereas Mr. Ardern and others have said if somebody was to implant foot and mouth here or some other horrible disease and decimate our dairy or our beef or our other sectors, it's almost game over, especially in dairy, a major part of our economy. So terrorism comes in many forms. Likewise, with no deliberate act, people coming across our borders, bringing in things they shouldn't, bringing in things they're ignorant of, without any malice intended, but again posing threats. I do recall sitting on the Primary Production Committee in the first term I was in Parliament, and I'm sure Mr. Ardern will recall this, where we had a great debate as Labor took office over the former National Government shifting resources. I think at that point it was away from container surveillance. And I'm sure Mr. Ardern recalls the debate where money was shifted around by the then National Government, penny pinched here, penny pinched there. I think it was away from away from container surveillance into airport biosecurity. And I think we did an inquiry on it, as I recall, and the massive risks that were identified around the random nature, as it was then, of container surveillance. I just wonder, there are some very good Kiwi companies. I think the company that I recall in Christchurch is at SIFT Technologies, I think it is, Mr. Ardern nods, who, as I understand it, have developed for many years a sort of, so have I, well, it's a good company. I possibly did. I may have used their technology to have you checked out biosecurity-wise, Mr. Mallard. But they have Indeed, and they developed, I think it was called a sniff technology, and to put it in layman's terms, because I'm not a technical expert, you can bang this box with this technology inside a container, for instance. It can take a sniff of the air, and it can tell you any sort of biological organism that is alive or dead in there, and it can identify where there's a threat. That may be why the new ACT leaders imported some of the technology for his caucus room. But the interesting thing at that point was I remember visiting the business, and biosecurity and customs at the time wouldn't use the technology. In fact, I don't think it's being used today. I know the different type of technology. I know the Australians At the time, I think SIF, one of their biggest contracts was Australian biosecurity. The Australians used it before us, so maybe there's a few lessons there that technology should be taken on board, and good old Kiwi technology could be taken on board, because the Aussies were a bit smarter than us. They used it, and our biosecurity guys at the time, I recall in the late 1999, when we embarked on this inquiry, were still doing very, very random container surveillance, extremely random. And I think we went down and had a look at some of it, and it was almost like, you know, they try and profile what may be a risk in a container, and away you go. There was an issue over pallets that were being, wooden pallets that were being brought in, which were having very little of any inspection. So it's not just airports. So I say to the government, we support the legislation, but I think they have to get serious, very, very serious, about the nature and constant restructuring of our biosecurity agencies. Is it right that math and food safety, poacher and gamekeeper, are in one? I don't think it is. I share Damien O'Connor's view. I think you've got to have some separation. Perhaps the difficulties that Fonterra's been through, different set of difficulties, but food safety and to some extent biosecurity as well, show that there is a deficiency and a weakness in having those organisations married up together. Sure, you want cooperation, you want synergy, but there has to be some sort of tension between those authorities to ensure that our borders are protected, and they're protected rigorously. So I look forward to the debate as we go through this legislation. Of course, there will have to be infrastructure and dollars put around this. Staff will have to be trained. There has to be a bigger commitment, as my colleague Darian Fenton said, to staff training and skilling. I often wonder, and I recall it was when I was on the select committee again, there was an issue raised about the old-fashioned Air New Zealand steward or stewardess who would come through with the aerosol can in the old days, remember, and walk right down the aisle. And I remember one submitter saying, look, you know, one submitter saying that that was the best advertisement for people getting off the plane, those from foreign countries who didn't quite get how serious it is. That was the best sort of wake-up call advertisement. It was somebody going down spraying, even if it was spraying, I don't know, water, who cares? It was a wake-up call to people. Pardon? Pardon? Indeed. Thank you, Trevor. Hello. Trevor's approaching his 75th year and recounting us in history. But, you know, this is serious. The point is that is a wake-up call to people. You go over to, I lived in Perth for a time, and each state has biosecurity arrangements. I know that Western Australia, honey and other products you couldn't bring in. It was almost like you lived in another country when you went across those borders, either by air or by rail. Very serious. Other countries you go to, there are no biosecurity protections. You go to the States, you're asked, what are you bringing in? You XYZ. There's very little checking, if any, in the States. Certainly in parts of Europe, likewise. Yes, it is. I've just come through LA Airport in the last couple of weeks, and apart from ticking a box, no beagles, nobody sort of profiling bags, not as rigorous as there's a few guns, yeah, but not nearly as rigorous as New Zealand. So we want to see those standards maintained and enhanced so that we don't have the problems of other countries. We are exceptionally vulnerable. We are an island state. We are predominantly dependent on agriculture. And as I said, and I endorse the other speakers that have made the point, you know, one major biosecurity threat, even if it didn't come off, again dents our reputation. We've had foot and mouth scares that thankfully haven't come to anything, but even then, our reputation, our exports are at risk because people ask questions and people get concerned. The Fonterra experience, though different, should teach us a lot about how our reputation, our brand New Zealand, is at risk through these types of threats. So I support the bill and I look forward to its further scrutiny as we go forward.
Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member